Morning. If you got your Bibles, we're going to be in Matthew 7 and Matthew 11, if you want to be turning there and finding those. Matthew 7 and Matthew chapter 11. So who grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries on TV? My generation. All right, who went to bed scared to death sometimes because of what you had seen? Robert Stack, he was the host. He may have been the scariest guy on TV because he would do things like this. They had these unsolved mysteries, and the one that sticks out in my mind is the spontaneous combustion episode. Y'all remember that one? And so they'd come on at like 9 o'clock at night, which was right before bedtime. And you'd watch this show, and Robert Stack would tell you this story, and it's dramatized and everything. And what eventually happened is this person went to bed, and they blew up in the middle of the night for some strange reason. And then they'd sign off and say, okay, till next time, have a great night or whatever. And you go to bed as a 12-year-old thinking, all right, so this person went to bed and they blew up, so I'm going to go to bed. Or it would be like you went to bed and this guy came in and brutally murdered the family. And, okay, have a great night. See y'all next week. And so we went to bed and we couldn't sleep because of all these unsolved mysteries. The problem was not that they were scary stories. The problem is that they were unsolved, right? Because if it was a story about a guy who brutally murdered a family, that's bad and that's terrible. I'm not saying it's not. But if they caught the guy, that's one thing. But if he's still out there and you're about to go to bed and that's exactly what that family did before it all happened to them, then it's unsolved and it's open-ended, and now I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Do I go to bed? Do I keep an eye open? How am I going to do this? Scary stuff. And so it reminds me a lot of what Jesus would do with people. We have a lot of sermons, and I'm guilty just as much as anybody else, of preaching sermons that are basically sometimes, here, 5 ways to improve your life, or here, 6 steps to be happy. I just did 8 weeks on how to go back to something better than normal. I will say sometimes those sermons are good and necessary and even really beneficial for us. But that's typically not how Jesus approached spiritual things. There were no real 5-step plans when it came to Jesus and his message. There were no 6 easy tips to have a better family life, to be a better husband, to be a better wife. You don't find a whole lot of that in Jesus. What you have Jesus doing a lot of times is presenting a story or sharing some kind of message, and the people are left scratching their heads. What in the world was he trying to tell us? Whenever I preach a sermon and somebody comes to me afterwards or later on that day or sometime during the week and they say, hey, I don't really get what you were talking about. To me, sometimes that's, I didn't communicate very well. Or maybe I didn't do a very good job of piecing together that message. But people would often come to Jesus, pull him aside. I mean, these are his close followers. And they would say things like, so explain to us what you meant this morning. When you were talking about prayer, when you were talking about the kingdom of God and all that business about give up everything, tell me exactly what you meant there. And the problem that they had with Jesus' message is that he left a lot of it open-ended. And so they had to chew on it a little bit. And they had to wrestle with it. And they had to struggle on it. And they had to try to digest exactly what Jesus was talking about. It was essentially sometimes a paradox. A paradox is pretty simply stated, it's 2 statements that seem to be at odds with one another, but when you put them together, you get a fuller picture of the truth. And so Jesus would say things like, you become great by being last, or you become first by being last. You become great by being small. If you want to really live, then you've got to die to yourself. He said these things that, taken on the surface, they seem like they're at odds with one another. But when you put them together and you really think through what he says, it makes a whole lot of sense. So we're going to investigate for a few weeks some of these. No easy answers, no 5-step plans, just here are a couple of statements that Jesus said or that Paul wrote. They seem to be at odds with one another. Let's take a look at them and figure out if they are or if we can get a better picture of the truth. Let's start in Matthew chapter 11. All right, let's look at Matthew chapter 11. Let's talk a little bit about Christianity. So sometimes we think, well, Christianity is easy. Well, it's an easy path. It's an easy road. His commands are not burdensome, John writes. And so, is Christianity easy, or is Christianity a difficult religion? So in Matthew chapter 11, we have one of these statements from Jesus, verses 28 through 30, where Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That sounds great. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And then he says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Okay, I like that. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. You can come and find rest for your souls if you're weary and heavy laden. And so it sounds easy, right? It's an ease, it's a joy. But then you back up a little bit to the Sermon on the Mount, and in Matthew chapter 7, same Jesus, same life, just 3 or 4 chapters earlier, in Matthew 7, verse 14, Jesus says, "The gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." So let's camp out there for a second. All right, Christianity. In Matthew 11, Jesus says, hey, easy. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, it's a hard path. It's a difficult road to travel. And so we're left with this question about, okay, what do you mean? I don't get it, right? Is it hard or is it easy? What do you mean by this? If I say that Christianity is easy, does that remove the cost of discipleship from myself and from other folks? If I say that Christianity is hard and that it's all based on my effort and my perfection, does that belittle the sacrifice of Jesus? And so where are we on this? It's kind of difficult. It's open-ended. I got to chew on it. We got to wrestle with it. Is Christianity hard or is it easy? Let's start in Matthew chapter 7. All right? Christianity is sometimes hard. That's what Jesus says in Matthew 7, verse 14, when he says, the gate is narrow and the way is hard. In Jerusalem, that's a city of lots of gates. Some of them, like the sheep gate, were really large because, they were a society based on sacrifices, and so you had to have some gates that were big enough to get your sheep and oxen and whatever else you're going to bring to the altar. You had to get it into the city, and you had to get it to the temple, and so there are a lot of gates that are wide so that people can just flow through there. There are some other gates that are like one person only. It's like a turnstile kind of thing where you only go one at a time, and you get a bottleneck right here, and you got to wait your turn, and you don't just go with the flow. You've got to make some effort to get through those particular gates. And so they had wide gates and they had very narrow gates. They had large paths and they had very small, narrow ways. Jesus plays on that in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, you got to enter through the narrow gate. It's a difficult way because what Jesus is saying is you can't just go with the flow all the time. That's difficult for us. And so in this way, Christianity may be a little bit hard because if I see what everybody else is doing and everybody else is just kind of going with the flow, then Jesus says you can't just do that. That's not what Christianity is about. It's a religion. It's a belief system that calls people at times to renounce some of their possessions. Well, you have possessions. You own them because you like them, because you decided at some point to buy them. And if Jesus goes to people and he tells them, like the rich young ruler, and says, well, you need to sell all that you have and give it away to the poor, then you can come follow me, that's not easy at all. That's why the rich young ruler goes away full of sorrow, because he loves his stuff. Christianity calls him down a difficult path. Jesus talks about losing your life to find it. Well, losing a life is not an easy thing, right? That's to die to myself, to sacrifice, to do away with my selfish ambitions. That's losing my life. Those are difficult things. It's not easy. And so in that vein, Christianity is hard. Jesus calls us to give up all, to give up whatever is holding us back from following after him. Well, we hold on to those things because we like them, because it's natural, because we want to. And when he calls us to give some of those things up, whether it's stuff or selfishness or relationships or bad habits, those are difficult things to give up. And so, of course, Jesus says you can't just go with the flow. Christianity involves decisive actions, choices, decisions that we've got to make to do away with some of these things that draw us away from God and get closer to some things that are going to draw us near to God. So Christianity, in Matthew 7, it draws us down a hard path. It's tough. Those are difficult things for us to do in our lives. And so is it right to say Christianity is hard? Absolutely. But then you got to look at what he really says in Matthew chapter 11. Is Christianity hard? Sure. But is it only hard? It can't be. Because in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, he says, my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. You come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest in your souls. And so Jesus is offering, on some level, an ease, a comfort, refreshment, joy to burdened people. Let's talk a minute about yoke. All right, that's a word that we get a little bit confused on sometimes. Is it like an egg? Is it what a pilot uses? Or is it something totally different? Well, first century world, they would have known exactly what the yoke is. It's the burden of teaching or something like that. And so the Pharisees, the religious folks of the day, the scholars of the day, the experts in the law of God, they would have bound heavy burdens, heavy yokes of teaching on people. And they would say, look, these are all the laws of God, and in addition to those laws that you find from Genesis to Malachi in the Old Testament, there are also a lot of oral laws that we've passed down, and so you got to keep all those if you're going to be right with God and right with us. That's the yoke of their teaching, the saddle of their teaching. It's what they laid on people, and if you're going to be right with God and right with us, then you've got to do all these different things. And so Jesus plays off of that, and he says to people who have been burdened by all those teachings, that heavy yoke that the Pharisees would put on folks, he says, you who are weary and heavy laden because of all those things, you come to me, Jesus says, and I will give you rest for your souls, because my yoke, my teaching burden is easy. My burden, he says, is light. So what does that mean? And is that at odds with what he says just a few chapters earlier in Matthew chapter 7? Christianity's hard, but also Christianity is easy. Here's his message, the message of Jesus to people who are burdened, who are struggling under heavy loads in this life. He says, look, Christianity offers an ease, a certain amount of ease morally. And I'm thinking about like what happens with the woman who's caught in the very act of adultery in John chapter 8. And Jesus brings her in and he says, who's going to throw the first stone? If you're without sin, go ahead and do it. And they all start to file out. All of her accusers are gone. And Jesus looks at her, a woman who is clearly guilty. Right? She has no excuse. There's no way out of this for her. She was brought in the very act. And he says, look, I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. And what a breath of fresh air. She had literally been brought there to be stoned. They literally said, hey, our law of Moses says we ought to stone this girl right here. What do you say? And he says, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Morally, she's been lacking in her life, but he says, let's clean it up. Let's go do better. Let's strive for a sinless life. Physically, maybe you're somebody that's burdened morally or physically, like the people who came to Jesus and they're born blind, or they can't hear, they can't speak, or they can't walk, or whatever it may be. And they come to Jesus because they know that he offers them comfort, he offers them refreshing times, and he heals them, he offers them healing. And so in that way, Christianity offers a bit of ease for them. Financially, maybe not how we think, but I think about people like Lazarus who come to Jesus, Zacchaeus, who comes to Jesus, and he's a tax collector, and he's so good at stealing from folks that he's become a chief tax collector. He's made his way up the ladder because he's pocketing his pockets or lining his pockets with their money, and he's doing great things for the traders in Rome. But Jesus offers him a better way. And at the end of the day, Zacchaeus comes out and he says, look, if I've stolen and defrauded people, then I'm going to give back all kinds of money. I'm going to give half of my money away to the poor, because he found ease and comfort and acceptance in Jesus. There are people who come to him in the Gospels who are emotional wrecks. He goes to the deathbed of one of his best friends named Lazarus, and his sisters are there weeping, and they're angry at Jesus. One of the sisters, Martha, even goes outside and says, if you'd have come here sooner, Jesus, my brother wouldn't have died. She's angry. She's an emotional wreck. And Jesus says, he's just asleep. We're going to bring him back. And he even weeps with them there, an act of comforting someone who's an emotional wreck. So Jesus says to the person like the woman in the very act of adultery in John 8, to the deaf, the blind, the ones who have physical ailments, the ones who are bound by their love of their riches, the ones who are emotional wrecks, Jesus says, you can come to me and find rest for your souls, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Okay, one sounds great, right? Christianity is hard. That sounds tough. Christianity is easy. That sounds awesome. They're both uttered by the same person in the same book, 4 chapters apart. So how do we make any sense of this? How about this? How about Christianity is a light burden on a hard road? Now, let's take it in reverse for a second. Let's think about how the world typically operates. It's a path of least resistance kind of method. It's a let's go with the flow. Let's just kind of go where life takes us without having to make any hard choices. I want to stay away from sacrifice. I want to seek comfort. I want immediate gratification. And so that leads to kind of, an easy road. We just kind of go with the flow. But how many people do you know who live that way? Who seek their own good, who seek selfish ways, who live by their desires, but they carry huge burdens. Maybe they are emotional wrecks. Maybe they're tied to their selfishness. And maybe it's wrecking their lives and causing them to make some destructive decisions in their lives. And that's how the world operates. It gives you maybe an easy path to go with the flow, whatever gate you find, how wide the path is, but they carry heavy burdens on that road. The opposite of that is Christianity, which offers us a road that is hard. That's what Jesus said. He didn't say the life. He didn't say that his teachings, following them in our lives, he didn't say that's what's hard. He said the road's tough. Of course it is. It calls us to make sacrifices from myself to help other people. It calls me to die to myself so that I can live for God and live for others. Christianity is a religion, a belief system that calls me to deny self, to think of others before I think of myself. Those are unnatural, difficult things. It's a hard road. But it's also a religion that offers us grace, that offers us peace that surpasses understanding. It's a religion, a belief system that promises us the removal of guilt, the removal of shame, forgiveness whenever we fail. Something the world struggles with, Christianity has in abundance. And so it is tough. And I hope you leave here wondering, okay, so which is it? I don't want to give you 5 steps to understanding the paradox of is Christianity hard or is it easy? I want to give you 2 statements that seem to be at odds with one another. But think through it, chew on it, wrestle with it, and you come out with a better picture of truth. And the picture that Jesus gives us is that Christianity is a hard path. It's a hard road. You don't get there by going with the flow. You get there by making choices, by taking decisive actions, by seeking the will of God instead of my own will. It's a hard path. But on that path, we Christians carry a light burden. We know that his teachings are good for us. We know the truth of the gospel is freeing in our lives. We know that Jesus offers us forgiveness when we mess up, the removal of guilt whenever we have made mistakes, and the righteousness that he accomplished so that we can be right with God. Light burdens on a hard road. But let me ask you as we close this morning, have you had it backwards? That's what Christianity offers. Light burdens on a difficult road. Nobody said it would be easy. But maybe you have been somebody who's been traveling down the wide open path, the wide gates. And you just kind of go with the flow, and you're not really trying to be decisive in what you do to serve God. You're just kind of doing what everybody else does. You're just going through, following the crowd, whatever it may be. But you're burdened. And you're somebody who's carrying heavy burdens in your life, physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, relationally. You're carrying these heavy burdens on your own. It's supposed to be an easy path, but it's miserable for you because you got it backwards. Would you accept Jesus at his word to give you, provide for you, yes, a hard path of self-denial, of dying to self, of sacrifice, of delayed gratification. Hard path, but his burden is light. A God who loves you so much to send his son to die for you. People in this room who love you enough to come alongside you and pray for you and weep with you and rejoice with you and help you and sacrifice for you. A loving God who calls you into relationship with him. Light burdens, easy burdens on a heavy road. This morning, if you have any change you want to make, any kind of response that you want to make before God and before God's people, we do want to invite you to do that every time we are together. And maybe right here and right now, it's that you've been traveling down a broad street, broad way, but you've been carrying all these burdens. It's time to get rid of the burdens. Put them on God. Put them on the sacrifice of Jesus. He promises to take our sins from us and to alleviate our guilt. Maybe today is the day that you respond in faith, repenting of that life of sin, of selfishness, of immediate gratification, and turning towards God and accepting his call of light burdens on a difficult path. Maybe you begin that process today by being baptized, to have your sins washed away, the guilt is removed, and you stand up out of the water to live a new life. Maybe you're a Christian, but you're still walking down kind of a broad path, and you're burdened every day of your life with who knows what, you know. Maybe today is the day that you unload those. Maybe there's something going on in your life right here and right now we can pray about, and we can encourage you as your brothers and sisters, your family of Christians here. whatever your need is, there's a fountain free. If you want to come, please do so now while we stand and while we sing.